Now we're going to talk about the role that carbohydrates play in the diet. And again, this is another field of major controversy, major conflict, and just overall confusion as far as how do carbohydrates or sugar play into an optimum diet. And when most people talk about carbohydrates, they're actually talking about processed carbs in the form of pasta, in the form of bread, cookies, pastries, cereal, this kind of thing. And so we want to actually take all those processed carbohydrates that are typically wheat-based and remove them from the whole equation altogether, and then come back into what's actually natural, normal, and original forms of carbohydrates or sugars for proper metabolism. And I want to say real quickly on this note that this reminds me of the mindset or the mentality of a beginner and a master. So the beginner's mindset is typically one in duality, one that thinks in black and white, yes or no, good or bad. So all the no sugar and low carbohydrate fanatics out there, people that are out there saying that carbohydrates are bad, sugar's bad, it's going to raise your insulin, it's going to raise your blood pressure, or your blood sugar, it's going to, cause diabetes and whatever. They're not really looking at it from what I would consider an expert or master's perspective. The master sees all the spectrums of color on the color wheel. And so they can actually differentiate between what's appropriate and what's not appropriate in any given circumstance because they see all the pieces on the chessboard. They're not biased and swung based on their own personal agenda. So I just want to say that before we move forward. Now, in Chinese herbalism, sweetness is one of the 5 flavors, and actually sweetness is represented by a certain sweetness for life, the twinkle in the eye of a child, and that same twinkle that many of us have foregone for the rigors of adulthood. And I find that that has a similarity when it comes to low sugar, when we're kind of forcing ourselves to get off sugar, fruit, carbohydrates. We kind of just will ourselves off of that whole category, and a lot of times it's actually not appropriate for overall metabolism and just ease and pleasure in life. What ends up happening for a lot of people is that when you completely negate sweet from the diet, our personality becomes a little more astringent, our relationships become a little more sour, our communication becomes a little more bitter, and our overall life becomes a little more salty. So we want to create a unification and a balance of all the different food groups out there. Okay, now with that said, one thing that we have to be aware of when it comes to high sugar diets, high carbohydrate diets, because again, my whole philosophy is how do we create a middle path? How do we create a balanced equilibrium between all the macronutrients and all the food options that are available on the menu board of nature? And when it comes to carbohydrates, there's a number of things that we're going to look at. The first thing is just fruit in general. And typically in the raw food world, the main diets that are proposed are high fruit-based diets. And they tend to be promoted as low-fat, raw, vegan diets, high carbohydrate, fruit-based diets. And there's a lot of issues when it comes to that. And I've seen that when it comes to the promotion of high fruit diets, the exception is not the rule. And so a lot of people are actually promoting that and giving extreme examples of success stories or relatively success stories. I don't even know if you'd really call it success in the long term. People feel really good for 2 weeks, 3 weeks, a year, 2 years, 3 years. Some very unique situations, 10 years and beyond. People are taking those unique situations and trying to create almost like a sensationalization out of it, trying to create like a marketing promotion out of it for the diet, this being the most optimum diet for the human race. And so we have to be careful about that when we get into these highs and lows. We want to create an equilibrium. Now, understand that if you do choose to eat a lot of fruit or a lot of sugar-based foods, a lot of carbohydrates, whether they be simple carbohydrates or complex carbohydrates, like starchy carbohydrates, for example, then you need to have more activity in your life. The more activity, meaning the more active, the more exercise that you do in your life, the bigger your sugar gas tank is going to be. The more metabolizing of sugar that you're going to be able to do. But if you're not active, if you're a little more sedentary, you're on the computer, you're doing videos like this maybe, you're not really running around and you're not exercising and using that high octane fuel, that's what sugar really is. Sugar is like a jolt to your system. It goes into your blood and it creates an electric reaction. It's like high octane fuel. And if you don't use that fuel appropriately and almost immediately, then it could actually cause an acidification in the blood. It could cause a leaching of alkaline minerals like calcium, because when that blood is just floating around, or that sugar is just floating around the blood, it's not being properly metabolized, then it can cause a leaching of minerals like calcium to help actually buffer the acidification of too much sugar in the bloodstream. And we do know that cancer cells, for example, mutated cells, have 13 to 15 times the insulin receptor sites of normal, healthy, oxygen-respiring cells. Right? And we do know that cancer respires or breathes off fermentation and the depletion of oxygen. And so these are just important things to consider, is that the appropriate situation where a lot of carbohydrates may or may not work for you, in terms of understanding your digestive system. If you have a digestive infection, like a candida overgrowth, a fungal overgrowth, a bacterial infection, a viral infection, a form of cancer, for example, any kind of digestive irregularity, then sugar may not be appropriate for you. It most likely is not, and you may have to lower the load and start to move towards no sugar-based sweeteners like stevia, like non-refined stevia, for example, to get a little bit of that sweet flavor, but not to get the sugar stimulation. And this is temporary. This is not an ideal thing to do forever, but when you're on a therapeutic-based diet, then considerations like this have to be taken seriously. I've seen it over and over in the raw food world, is that people get swung on the extremes of diet and they buy into what someone said about, sugar doesn't cause cancer, sugar doesn't feed cancer, doesn't feed candida, it's all fat. Fat clogs up the receptor sites, which is true in a certain sense when we're talking about like vegetable oils, when we're talking about hydrogenated and synthetic oils. That stuff will coat over the receptor cells and cause an insulin problem where sugar is not able to be metabolized properly into the cells. But that I digress. That's a whole other situation. So those are some of the issues that can arise from too much carbohydrates in the diet if it's not appropriate for you. If it is appropriate for you, then it's something that should be indulged in when you feel the pull, when you feel the need. My preference for that indulgence is honey. I love honey. I think honey is the most amazing substance in the world. It's a natural, I guess you could say, almost like summation of that given ecosystem by the bee. The bee gathers all the little nuances of that environment and concentrates it into honey, which is the most enzymatically active food in the world. And interestingly enough about honey is that it's a pretty good amount of sugar per weight, and it's also an antibacterial and antifungal substance. It's kind of an anomaly. And then my other favorite sweetener, natural-based sweetener, of course, is maple syrup. I really love maple syrup. It's incredibly mineral dense, just like honey. It's a little lower on the glycemic index, and it's just a really amazing snack. It's something great to put into your tonics, into your smoothies, maybe make some raw food, superfood confections, that kind of thing. It's really important that we treat ourselves. We don't want to constantly be in the situation where we're depriving ourselves, we're restricting ourselves, and we're kind of negating the pleasures of life because of a certain workaholic type of mentality that we all have ingrained into us. If you're watching this video, I bet you're the type of person that is committed to excellence, that's committed to their personal development. Otherwise, why would you even bother watching this video? Why would you care about improving your diet if you don't care about improving your life? So we have to learn to celebrate our well done day, so to speak. Celebrate our accomplishments. And one of the great ways to do that nutritionally is through really great sources of sugar or carbohydrates. Another thing I want to say too about carbohydrates is that for years I was a raw foodist completely, meaning that I only ate raw food. In fact, if I didn't eat, if I snuck some kind of like corn chip or some kind of cooked food thing, I felt a little sense of guilt come over me. And it took me a little while to wash that all away, and thank goodness for that. Thank goodness for that. And one of the things I found actually to be very beneficial for me, especially in the more yin phase of the season, the more winter phase when it's a little colder, I leave alone a lot of the water-rich fruits, and I go towards complex carbohydrates like potatoes, specifically sweet potatoes, yams, maybe wild rice. I love quinoa. Those kind of things can be very beneficial for grounding the system, for balance. And some of the longest civilizations in the world actually made starch-based foods their staple. So potatoes and rice in particular were actually staples in so many civilizations throughout the world. And it's something that's innocuous. It's something that's non-allergenic in most cases, especially rice. It's not typically the most nutritious thing from broad spectrum mineral analysis or broad spectrum vitamins, but as far as glycogen restoration in your liver, sugar metabolism, and actually having long chain polysaccharide sugars to help actually mitigate that or to stabilize blood sugar and satiation, those are really fantastic options for balancing our diet. So in a nutshell, that is the wrap on carbohydrates. There's a lot more we could discuss on this subject, but again, I want to point out here is that I'm not for the low sugar diet and I'm not for the high sugar diet. I think there's valid points on each end of the spectrum, but ultimately it comes into bringing everything back into homeostatic equilibrium.